Hello, welcome, and thank you for joining us tonight for our Canary Live event. Hashtag the Canary Live. Make sure you hit that up on Twitter. We're going to be talking about Julian Assange, no extradition. This is probably the most important case of press freedom in modern history. Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks and a journalist, faces a possible prison sentence of 175 years if he's extradited to the United States for the UK. And this is really for his work exposing US war crimes, amongst many other things. Like many of you, I was really kind of brought into the dark side of the military-industrial complex by a lot of Julian Assange's work, particularly the collateral damage video that showed what drones are getting up to. And Julian right now is being punished for doing really the most important job that journalists are here to do, which is to get hold of anonymous sources, get hold of that data that we need to make sure that the people empowered in our countries are operating within the law. A group of politicians, journalists and activists gathered outside the Old Bailey Criminal Court in London in September during his final extradition hearing, and we're waiting for the ruling, which will be in first thing in the new year, January 2021. So we're here this evening with an awesome panel to talk a little bit about the case, why it is so important to press freedom, the level of corruption around the case itself, the impact of the US election, what that might bear for Julian and his future, and also the future of press freedom. So first, I'd like to welcome our panelists and speakers this evening. First up, we've got John Rees. John is a bit of a legend, so he needs no introduction, but I will give him one anyway. He's a writer, broadcaster, and activist. He's one of the organisers of the People's Assembly, and he's here also in respect to the Don't Extradite Assange campaign. We've also got our beloved, intrepid Canary journalist, John McEvoy here. He's a presenter of the Canary video, Assange, No Extradition. And we're also able to have with us this evening Dr. Deepa Driver. She's a trade unionist, a member of the National Executive Committee of UCU, and she also organises the Free the Truth events in defence of Julian Assange. So how we're going to go this evening, we're beginning now, we're going to roll through till 8:30. After this introduction, we're going to have 10 minutes from each of our speakers. Then I'm going to ask them a couple of rounds of questions, and then we will be hitting up Facebook and YouTube for your questions. So make sure that as the event's going, you're putting your questions up on social media. We will be gathering them and I will be addressing them to the speakers at the end. So without further ado, I think we should get into things. So first of all, could we hear from you, John Rees?
Thanks, Kerry-Anne, and thanks very much for the invitation to speak here tonight, and my thanks to the Canary for all the remarkable reporting that it's been doing on the Assange case right the way through. There is so much that can be said about the Assange case. Julian, of course, spent 6 years in the Ecuadorian embassy, is now well over a year in Belmarsh prison. So you've got closing in on a decade of isolation, really, because of persecution by the United States, attempts to prosecute him for releasing the material, primarily on the Afghan and Iraq war logs, on the Guantanamo material, and on Cablegate. And I think it's important to say that, first of all, I've been in court for the entirety of the extradition hearings, and it's very, very clear from the American prosecution that this is what they're after him for. Overwhelmingly, the material they return to time and time again is the material that was released about Iraq and Afghanistan. So, the commentary that sometimes goes on about other things that WikiLeaks have done are, for the United States, beside the point. That's not what they're extraditing him for. It's not what he's charged for in the 18 charges that the United States are attempting to prosecute him for if they get him onto American soil. So I guess that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that for all that's involved in this, for all the actual history of events behind the releases, the way in which the releases took place, Julian's time in prison, his condition in prison now, his treatment by the authorities, his possible treatment in prison if he gets extradited to the United States. It's an enormously complex case, of course, and I'm sure we'll touch on many of those things tonight. But the thing that I'm concerned to focus on for people is this, that when it comes right down to it, there is something absolutely blindingly simple at the heart of this. And it's this question: do you think that you have the right to know things which powerful institutions, governmental and corporate, in this country and abroad don't want you to know? If you think that you should know about some of the things that were released in the Iraq war logs, about the rules of engagement for United States and other soldiers invading a foreign country in what was, after all, an illegal invasion, if you think that you ought to know what your tax money and the lives of your fellow citizens are being spent doing in Afghanistan or Iraq, if you think you ought to know what's being done in your name inside Guantanamo prison, or what your diplomats are doing in your name on the international stage, if you think you ought to know that, and that it didn't ought to be simply in the hands of people who commit those acts, sometimes those crimes, whether or not you know that, then you're on the side of Julian Assange. Because he did what all good journalists should do. He found out information that the rich and powerful didn't want you to know, and he put it in the public domain. It's as simple as that. And that's what the United States are prosecuting him for. They're prosecuting him because he told you things that they didn't want you to know, important things about the number of deaths. You know, one of the defense witnesses in the hearing that's just closed was John Sloboda from Iraq Body Count. And he told the court that the release of WikiLeaks material allowed us to learn that there were 15,000 more deaths in Iraq at that point than even Iraq Body Count had been able to tell us about. So just if you think, and you have to remember, of course, the United States and Britain and the allied countries, the people involved in the invasion and occupation of Iraq, never made a body count. That they never had an official body count. So these were the only figures that you could learn from, and they were significantly increased by the material that WikiLeaks released. So if you think that's a worthwhile thing to do, a worthwhile thing to know about, then you should be on Julian Assange's side and not on the side of the people who are trying to prosecute him. And after all, when you come right down to it, if news were only news that was sanctioned by government and corporate bodies, there'd be precious little worth listening to. News is only news. Journalism is only functioning properly when it's telling you things that you wouldn't know otherwise. You know, if it were just what was sanctioned, don't bother buying a newspaper or going online. Just read the press release. Just read the statement given out by the government, given out by the corporations. Just read it on the headed paper. That's all you're going to know. But if you think there might be some more that you ought to know to make a proper judgment about the state of the world and what's going on in it, then you need whistleblowers and you need people who are willing to print what they say. That's only two sources of news, the official version and the rest. And if you haven't got both, you haven't got anything that's remotely near a full picture. So, you know, it seems almost banal to say these things. It seems so basic and elementary when it comes down to it that it didn't ought to need saying at all. And indeed, it didn't need to be said. It didn't ought to be said at all. But that's what's at stake in this case. They will, if they can, get Julian Assange onto American territory, and they will charge him with espionage for doing the things that I've described, for behaving like a journalist. And this is a number of the expert witnesses in the hearing recently made this point over and over again, most powerfully perhaps Daniel Ellsberg, the figure at the heart of the Pentagon Papers leak, said, look, there's an attempt now, he put it this way, he said, look, there's an attempt now to paint me as a kind of elder figure, a kind of, respectable grandfather of journalism. But he said, all this was said about me when I linked the Pentagon Papers. Everything that I did, Julian Assange has done. There is no essential difference between the two cases. You can't have your nasty cyber terrorist, to use Joe Biden's phrase, Julian Assange and cuddly old uncle Dan Ellsberg. That isn't a true picture, he said. Clive Stafford Smith said, look, there are things here about Guantanamo which I didn't know, even though I was representing prisoners in Guantanamo. I didn't know them until they came out in the WikiLeaks stories. So there it is. When you strip it all away, it's the question of whether or not doing this work is spying, is espionage. That's what Julian Assange is going to be tried under, the 1917 Espionage Act in the United States. First time ever that it will be used against a journalist. And it will be used in quite a cynical way. James Lewis is the leading prosecutor for the United States in the court. He's an ex-SAS man. He's a Chief Justice of the Falkland Islands. He has on his wall at home a framed copy of the Falkland Islands newspaper from the day that the British beat the Argentinians for possession of the Falkland Islands. So I think you can see that he's the kind of go-to lawyer for the British state and the British establishment when it thinks it's got a serious case on its hands. And in this case, indeed, for the United States, when they think they've got a serious case on their hands. They don't want this to turn into a fight between them and the mainstream media, and that's why they're trying to isolate Julian Assange. They want to send a message to the mainstream media. If you print stuff that people like this give you, you're going to be in trouble, but they don't want to confront them. So they want to isolate Julian Assange, pretend that he's not a journalist, pretend that what he was doing is spying, but make no mistake, he's the victim, but the target is the entirety of any kind of investigative journalism. And that's why there's been quite a turnaround in the mainstream press's attitude to this case in recent months. We now have the editorial position of the Daily Telegraph, the Times, the Daily Mail, all now saying, yes, we understand that we've got a dog in this fight, that Julian Assange shouldn't be extradited, that it's a threat to journalism. And it's belated, but it's important that they've suddenly discovered that there's something going on there. So you don't want to get caught on the wrong side of the Daily Telegraph, is my view. And certainly if you're on the left, you don't want to be less radical than the Daily Telegraph, I'd say. So I think it's the responsibility of the entire Labour movement, the entire progressive movement, to get on board with this campaign and to start elevating it. After all, just think back over recent months. What would we know about COVID if it weren't for NHS whistleblowers and journalists willing to print what they say? It's a central part of the functioning of any barely democratic society. And I don't want to overstate the amount of democracy in this society, but it will be significantly less if this kind of stuff doesn't happen. So it's really,
that's brilliant, John.
Comes down to it, that simple.
That's great. Thank you so much, John. And as you say, it's one of those cases where it's very easy to forget that there is a human being at the center of it. You know, a father. You know, this is a guy who is a human being, the same as you and I, are subject to just the most extreme stresses and pressures and deprivation. It's really hard to imagine sometimes, you know, how he goes on, to be honest, inside of this bubble, and yet he knows at the same time that he is the canary in the coal mine, you know, because he is there representing all of us journalists, all of us citizens who need to get access to this information and have the right to print it without being worried about spending the rest of our lives in prison. So thank you, John. Okay, and now we're going to go over to Dr. Deepa Driver. Deepa?
Thanks, Kerry. And thank you very much for hosting this event. It's really important that we have this debate. And I was quite taken by your tweet, which drew a parallel between what's happening to Jeremy at the moment and what happened to Julian, or is continuing to happen to Julian. And I think when you think of Julian Assange, other than WikiLeaks, the only other phrase that comes to mind is stitch, because that's what this entire case is about. It's a stitch up. And it's a stitch up because, and you know, as a British citizen, and somebody who was born in one of the colonies and has, you know, moved to Britain, I say this, that I expected the legal process here to be reasonably robust. I expected the rule of law to prevail. And what's really hit home very much through attending Julian's hearings at Westminster Magistrates Court and being in the court at the Old Bailey is that the rule of law has been cast aside. Not only has the rule of law been cast aside, there is not even an attempt to give due process. And that's what, so the parallel is so evident, which is the blatantness with which the British establishment is trampling on our rights, is smearing us, is repeating lies and pretending that we're stupid enough to believe it's the truth. And that kind of sits at the heart of my comments today, which are my concern about the involvement of the UK in the long-term severe psychological ill treatment of Julian, his torture, as Niels Melzer, the UN Special Rapporteur, put it, and as the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention also confirmed. And the disregard with which the British authorities are treating their duties and responsibilities under both domestic law and international law. The absolute deprivation of any right to a fair trial, for any protection of his private life, for his right to freedom of speech, and for our right under freedom of speech to listen, to understand and to comprehend the truth. Most importantly, how Britain is becoming more and more a vassal state. Britain is being treated by the US in a way in which, and so are many other countries, where the US is saying we have sweeping, extraordinary extraterritorial rights. Our laws apply anywhere else in the world. Not only do our laws apply anywhere else in the world, if you are an activist, say an environmental activist in Indonesia, or somebody revealing war crimes in Iraq, or somebody revealing corruption in the Middle East or Africa or in parts of Britain, what we can do is we can pluck you out, we can try you under American laws without First Amendment protections, and then while you're on remand, we can put you into a black hole, which is essentially what the special administrative measures are, which is this wonderful phrase that the Americans use for putting you pretty much in solitary confinement and not allowing you or your lawyers to speak to the press or to the outside world without their permission and without their approval. And that's what they're trying to do to Julian. And you're right, this case is not just about Julian, this is about us. This is about whistleblowers. This is about the public's right to know about the crimes that our governments commit in our name. But this is also about our right to have institutions and processes where we can seek redress and where we can have some semblance of order within our society. And as our society descends into huge amounts of chaos, Julian's case is a real exemplar of what's going wrong in our societies. And when you think about Julian's case, think about this man who's been for almost 7 years in the Ecuadorian embassy, kept there under false premises, so to speak, with the complicity of Keir Starmer, CPS, who, as you know, wrote saying to the Swedish authorities, asking them not to interview Julian in Britain and essentially saying, don't you dare get cold feet, you know, and intentionally creating a sense of, isolation and arbitrary treatment for Julian, where when he had a very serious tooth infection, he was not even allowed out to have hospital treatment, similar with a shoulder injury. He was put in such a situation where his lack of exposure to sunlight meant that if he bent down to tie his shoelaces, which he once did, he cracked a rib. And that's the kind of physical effect and physical torment that Julian has suffered. And now he is in a maximum security prison, in lockdown 22 hours a day, alone in a cell, without access to his family or his lawyers, which meant for the 6 months before the September hearings, he had not met with his lawyers. He was only the second superseding indictment, as they called it, which is the third indictment in effect from the US, came out only about 6 weeks before he was supposed to be tried. On the first day of the trial in September was when he was arrested in relation to this indictment, which meant he didn't have a chance to prepare with his lawyers in relation to the case. If you look at the way the trial was conducted, journalists and civil society organizations like Amnesty, Reporters Without Borders, the Haldane Society of Socialist Lawyers, for whom I went as a legal observer, and I speak here in a personal capacity, but all of us were excluded from the court. So we had to queue for the 2 seats that were made available in the public gallery when there were 66 seats across the 2 public galleries. So you queued very early in the morning. You were then intimidated by police officers who went around with huge guns early in the morning, asking you what you were doing there and saying that, for example, that you couldn't use the disabled lift, etc., etc. You then go into this courtroom, which is actually an annex where all you can see is a television screen about 30 feet away, and which is a small screen, and what you can see is what's happening in the next court. You're not even allowed to have a drink of water for the entirety of the hearing. And what you can see is all these wonderful, very capable, very knowledgegal people, ranging from Chomsky to somebody who's a prison warden in the US within these supermax prisons, to legal experts on the Espionage Act, all putting out information that we should know about in relation to what Julian did, and making it very clear that what Julian did was allow us to know what's really going on in relation to American war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it's for this reason that he's being persecuted. And you mentioned the collateral murder video. And this is a video where you see American soldiers pretending like it's a video game and shooting down unarmed civilians and children, mowing down people who are rescuing. These are war crimes. And it is a shame that instead of persecuting those or prosecuting those who are committing the war crimes, Bush, Blair, all of these people are walking free, while Julian Assange is sitting in a British prison, and most British people do not know that this is happening. And that's the shame of it. And that's the shame of our media, who have now, yes, started to talk. And I'm very happy to see some of the critical commentary that has come, the excellent article by Fidel Narvaez in the Grey Zone, some of the articles in the mainstream press. But you look at the quality of the coverage across the 4 weeks. Yes, it was better than before, where they didn't even say anything or smeared him. But the quality of the coverage was exceedingly weak, except for independent news outlets, not all of whom covered it, but some of whom covered it exceedingly well. And this is the shame, that our journalists don't recognize this, because they never intend to reveal the truth to us. They want to stand well behind the line, be fed press releases, work to the news cycle, perhaps talk a little bit about Johnny Depp's next domestic violence incident, create a little bit of hoo-ha about certain crimes there, maybe say something about Trump. And that's about it. The amount of genuine analysis that is required didn't come from anybody across those 4 weeks. And I was really embarrassed to say that I'm standing outside there in the queue for the public gallery at 6 in the morning. all through the day, you don't see any journalists around. Nobody comes to ask you, what's the problem with open justice? But then in court, they begin to talk about open justice when they want to find out whether Julian's had any pain relief medication while he was in the embassy, or whether there's been a razor blade found in his cell. This is their interest in open justice. And that's what galls me. And so, when you see whether the BBC, etc., were covering it, that's what galls me. And I just want to end on saying that this case is really important, because without whistleblowers, without their courage, without the courage of Snowden, Manning, Kiriakou, and others, we would not know what's really going on. We would not know how many people were raped, murdered, and tortured in Iraq and Afghanistan. We would not know the crimes that were taking place in Abu Ghraib. We would not know that in Guantanamo, people are being tortured in this manner. We would not know that Khalid al-Masri was kidnapped from the Macedonian border, a German citizen, kidnapped, sodomized, tortured for 6 months. And during this time, they found out that he was not whom they thought he was, and they still didn't release him. And this is not the case of one isolated prisoner being tortured. This is the general practice. And it is very important that classification is not used to hide crimes and to hide embarrassment of these absolutely terrible politicians. So I invite the left to grow a spine and stand with Julian Assange to take a stance against what's happening to our country and what's happening to other countries around the world. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Deepa. And yes, I mean, it is breathtaking, frankly, to sort of watch the lethargy of the mainstream media on this story, given the gravity of it. I mean, there's a part of you that thinks, well, let's be honest, most of these people are no longer in the game of actual real journalism and, telling truth to power. It almost now feels like a quaint concept. When we bring it up, you almost see the sort of the establishment press rolling their eyes at us like, oh, yes, yes, your dreams of real journalism. We all know it's actually about having cocktails in Westminster and the latest gossip. And you just can't believe in the moment that we're living through right now, the sort of the abdication of responsibility on the part of those journalists, and probably nowhere is it more pronounced than in the Assange case. So thank you very much for that, Deepa. It was excellent. Okay, and now we're over to Mr. John McEvoy to hit us up with another 10 minutes of expertise.
Right, yeah, cheers for having us. And thanks to Canary in general for hosting this, because I mean, you talk about the abdication of responsibility of journalism, and I mean, it's totally true for the mainstream media, but I mean, with the Assange case, we've seen the alternative media as well as in many cases abdicated on this wildly important case as well. So yeah, I think that's a really important point. But I mean, generally, I wanted to kind of build on some stuff that Deepa was talking about. I mean, you called it a stitch up, like this entire case is a stitch up, and Deepa said that the rule of law has been totally cast aside. I just totally agree. I'd like to go over pretty much a decade of the UK violating Julian Assange's human rights, violating or considering to violate international law by the rule of might rather than the rule of right. And I mean, one of the main cases that's actually forgotten about at the moment is back in 2012, shortly after Assange entered the Ecuadorian embassy. The UK government actually threatened Ecuador with invading the embassy and removing Assange personally. And Ecuador strongly resisted that attempt, which was quite clearly on Obama's orders. I mean, shortly after that, Sweden tried to drop the extradition request in 2013. And the CPS lead on this case personally contacted the Swedish prosecution and told them, don't you dare get cold feet on this issue. So they basically pressured the Swedish prosecution to keep the case open, to buy some time while Assange was still in the Ecuadorian embassy, as the US was quite clearly, to most people at the time and to everybody apart from most of the Guardian columnists, that the US was preparing an extradition request against Assange, which was based on political persecution. After that, Assange remained in the Ecuadorian embassy for 9 years without charge, detained for 9 years without charge, We had UK Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt claiming that he was free to leave at any point, to which Nils Melzer, who's already been mentioned, said he was just as free to leave the Ecuadorian embassy as someone in a rubber boat is on a shark pool. And there was absolutely no way he was ever free to leave the embassy, because if he were to leave the embassy, it was quite clear that he could either face a death sentence or life in imprisonment in the US, because the UK government would have got their hands on him. April 2019, he's taken to Belmarsh prison. Now, this is another totally egregious irregularity of this entire case. He was taken to the UK's version of Guantanamo Bay on a bail skipping offence. As Declassified UK showed, there was only one other person in that prison that was held in the UK's Guantanamo on a bail skipping offence. He served his time on the bail skipping offence. However, the UK government decided to keep him in Belmarsh prison irregardless, for fear that he was a flight risk or he would abscond from justice. And that's before even getting to the most recent extradition hearing in September 2020 in London, and all of the irregularities and inconsistencies that surrounded that. I mean, if there are a couple of inconsistencies, you'd say, okay, maybe. But with the amount that surrounded this entire case, the only thing you conclude is this is extreme, severe political persecution. So, I mean, you look at the conditions that Assange is held in Belmarsh prison prior to each hearing at the Old Bailey Criminal Court. He was got up at 5 a.m., strip searched, arbitrarily strip searched. He was then taken out to what his partner Stella Morris described as a stand-up coffin, which was a van, a private, I believe it was Serco, in fact, or G4S, a security van that would take him to the prison. He actually found out on the very day of the first day of the hearing that a third superseding indictment had been unveiled against him. That's on top of not having any time to prepare his defence at all, because he couldn't have any access to his lawyers in the prison. Once again, on the very first day, 40 different NGOs and legal observers had their access removed arbitrarily. Rebecca Vincent of Reporters Without Borders told me, as I was there covering it for the Canary, told me that she'd never had more difficulty monitoring a trial in her entire life. She said she had monitored trials in Turkish prisons and felt much more welcome and had a much easier time monitoring what was going on. I mean, where we were sat in the room, it was impossible to even see Assange, apart from every now and then through a video screen. And it was therefore impossible for her to tell his mental, physical well-being, etc. Beyond that, I mean, it actually gets worse. I mean, Judge Emma Arbuthnot, and I see someone's mentioned this in the comments, there are major conflicts of interest regarding the judge that was originally presiding over this entire case. As Declassified UK once again revealed, her husband is connected to the UK intelligence. Her son is also connected to the UK intelligence via a company that is supposed to prevent leaks such as those that Julian Assange did. And someone asked in the comments if she formally recused herself or she was kicked out because of conflicts of interest. As far as I'm aware, she was not actually kicked out because of a conflict of interest, nor did she formally recuse herself. It's possible that she's still overseeing in an informal sense the proceedings. However, she has not formally recused herself, despite this clear evidence of conflicts of interest over a legal case that she was formally overseeing. Now, and this is the very worst part for me. This is the most egregious infringement of Assange's rights as a person, but also this fact totally removes his right to a fair trial, and that is the spying on him by a private Spanish security firm named UC Global at the time that he was in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. Now, this firm was contracted by US intelligence services. We're not sure if it was the CIA or the FBI at this point, but it was formally contracted by the US intelligence services to spy on Assange, including meetings with his psychologists, including meetings with his lawyers. Now, this includes spying on him as he spoke to people in the women's toilets of the Ecuadorian embassy in London. And now, not only did this firm spy on Assange, two anonymous witnesses told the court that that the US intelligence agencies in cahoots with this private security firm actually considered kidnapping or poisoning Assange while he was in the embassy, either in order to get him to leave the embassy, whereupon he could be arrested, or simply to kill him. So you've actually got a conspiracy on the side of the prosecution, on people who are effectively on the same side of the prosecution, that considered kidnapping or poisoning the defendant. I mean, this goes well beyond just Julian Assange's human rights. This also is an issue of the violation of the sovereignty of Ecuador, etc., etc. This is it's incredible on all fronts, really. As well as that, certain members of Julian Assange's legal team, such as Baltasar Garzan, a Spanish human rights lawyer, he was also reportedly followed and spied upon 2 weeks after US intelligence services discussed potentially going into his office and looking at his legal documents. His office was ransacked by people in balaclavas. And finally, and I mean, all of these issues were brought up throughout the hearing. So yeah, I mean, the point of all this is just to show how many consistent irregularities surround this case. Only so many accidents can remain an accident. This is beyond clearly political persecution of Assange, and of course, it's not just about him, although that is of crucial importance. It's also about, you know, the use of the law as a blunt instrument of power, which is obviously one of the first catastrophes of the end of democracy. So that's why this case is so important.
Cool. You had a minute left as well, John. Nice work.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, it's just as you were kind of going through that litany of abuse that, you know, that Julian has had to suffer personally, but also the kind of endemic corruption that just surrounds this and seeps through this entire case from top to bottom. I was struck by just remembering that I was there at the embassy, you know, those first days. I was there at the time, and just thinking actually how long ago that was. And, you know, you all reflect on, you know, what we've done with our lives, you know, since that point. You know, the Canary didn't exist. The Canary was 4 years away from existing at that point. And he has been under this relentless just abuse and torture this entire time. And, you know, when you think about, you know, then you go back and you go to the run up to the Iraq war. And the idea that we had to invade Iraq for the sake of democracy and civil liberties and justice. And the whole thing is just back to front. When you think that actually A, that was an illegal war, B, the guy that exposed the illegality of it is now being treated in every bit the disgusting and disgraceful ways that we were told Iraqis were being treated, which we were supposed to invade a country about. And yet we have, you know, most of our politicians, most of our journalists just kind of cracking on, you know, with life and acting as if this is no great shakes. And, you know, go back to kind of Deepa's point as well about how really the kind of chaotic time we're living through at the moment, where those double standards apply, where 1 minute, you know, these people are raving about the importance of journalism and truth and democracy and justice and all of these, you know, great, glorious concepts. And yet it seems like any time those concepts need to be upheld for a person who is maybe operating against their interests, suddenly they don't actually seem to give two hoots about those things anymore. And it is astonishing. I mean, you know, you read 1984, you know, and then you're in these moments and you go, this is the double speak we were warned of, that in the same sentence you can glorify these concepts of human rights and justice and democracy, and in the very next sentence doom, you know, a person to a decade of torture without so much as breaking a sweat. It is unbelievable. So thank you to all three of you for giving us so much information about the case. I know our audience wants this information. I know how hungry people have been for it. And it's great to have you all here tonight. I just wanted to touch on a couple of questions I had before we go to the YouTube and the Facebook groups. I guess given the night that we are holding this event right now, we've got Americans going to the ballot in a sort of one of the most depressing election cycles I think we've seen in our lifetimes, where we basically have, you know, on one side fascism, and on the other side, well, at least we're not fascists. I mean, those could be the strap lines really for the candidates. So without wishing to presume your answers, I think the question should be asked anyway. Do you think there will be a material difference in the way that Julian Assange either is treated if he is extradited, or the likelihood that he will be extradited based on the results of tonight's election? Go first, whoever would like to go.
Should I just have a go, because I'm probably the one who's least knowledgeable about the American elections, so might as well put forth my ignorance first. For me, actually, the American election in relation to Julian Assange, yes, of course, political crimes are not included within those who can be extradited within the US-UK Extradition Act. So the fact that the Judge Barretza in court specifically asked the defense, what effect do you think the US elections will have in terms of your submissions and what you will ask, suggests to me that even she is aware, although she might not let on, that this is a political case and it should not be tried at all, and this case should have been thrown out a long time ago. But I think the political situation in the US is a little bit of a red herring in some ways. And there is, of course, the implication that Donald Trump is probably a bit more aggressive about this than you might expect Joe Biden to be, because the Obama administration, despite its many killings through drone warfare, recognized that they had what they called the New York Times problem. That is, if they persecuted Assange, they would have to go after the New York Times. But the real thing is, Julian has been in arbitrary detention, isolated from his family. He's having, you know, as they've discussed in court, he's having serious medical issues. None of us know, as doctors for Assange and my esteemed colleague, Dr. Lisa Johnson often says, nobody knows what the long-term effects of torture are on the human body. And the torture can have huge effects on the internal organs. Julian is locked down with the chronic lung condition that he's had since 2012 in a prison where such diseases spread fast, as Professor Coker at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine has shown. So there is plenty of evidence that what the US really want to do is do what they said in the Stratfor leaks, which is move him from prison to prison, do a huge amount of lawfare, destroy his family, destroy his mental health. And, you know, literally what they are doing, what all these states are doing, Ecuador, Sweden, Australia, Britain and America are doing, is stamping on Julian's head every day through this, you know, through denying him the basic rights that he deserves. So it's about us making sure that we don't say, oh yeah, maybe in the High Court it will be okay, maybe in the Supreme Court it will be okay, maybe when he goes to the US he might be tried fairly. That's not it. He should be out now. And I would urge everybody to sign the open letter, which is on the Wise Up Action website, about Lady Arbuthnot. I would urge them to join with those people who are now putting in complaints in all jurisdictions, police complaints about misfeasance in public office by many of these senior people who should not be doing what they're doing. So for me, that's the extent of my contribution in the US elections, Kerry.
Thank you, Deepa. Do either of our Johns want to speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite a difficult question, actually, perhaps more difficult than you think at first, because the most likely answer is no, because the Trump administration is obviously deeply committed to this, if not Trump personally, certainly Mike Pompeo, right back to his time as CIA director, the core of the American state doesn't like this stuff happening and wants to make an example of Assange. As I said in the introduction, Joe Biden referred to Julian as a cyber terrorist, so I don't think that there's necessarily going to be much sympathy there. So the kind of starting point is, without massive pressure, you can't expect much change here, and so we'll have to supply that from somewhere else. But there are a couple of things worth saying. A Biden administration might be more vulnerable to that pressure because of the decision that the Obama administration took, which he was the vice president in, which was essentially, it's too difficult to prosecute Assange because otherwise we're going to line up with having serious sections of the mainstream media in our sites as well. And this is openly referred to, I mean, Deepa used the phrase that the New York Times problem, but this is openly referred to in court in these terms, that they've got this problem and that the Obama administration realized that they had this problem. So there's a kind of fracture in our opponent's case, which can be pushed here. And similarly with Trump, because James Lewis, the prosecution counsel in court, keeps on saying, look, how can you guys say this is a political case? Don't you know that Donald Trump was saying, I love WikiLeaks? How can a president that loves WikiLeaks be politically persecuting Julian Assange? That's their case in court. Now, we all know there's a rather different story with Donald Trump's pronouncements. He's elevated to an entirely different level. Ralph Waldo Emerson's observation that a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds. If that were true, we could certainly say that Donald Trump doesn't have a small mind, although that's hard to credit. He has said this. Before that, he said, I'd like to kill Julian Assange. Since then, he said, I don't know who Julian Assange is. I don't know anything about WikiLeaks. We all know that that President Trump's pronouncements can't be taken at face value, because the day after tomorrow he's going to say something exactly contradictory. And so there's a weakness in their case over the question of political persecution. So I think the best way of looking at this is that kind of from their own internal processes, no, we can't expect there to be more sympathy, but there are some cracks in both sides of this, whoever turns up in the White House, which a solidarity movement and indeed the lawyers in court can exploit.
Great, thank you, John. John McEvoy, did you want to speak to the US election?
Yeah, I will do so briefly. I mean, as John said, the simple answer is no. But even more simply, just because imperialism is such a basic function of US statehood, and Julian Assange presented such a monstrous threat to the sustenance of US empire by simply releasing raw data of its own functioning. I mean, imperialism is such a core tenet of the bipartisan political system in the US that I don't think there's any way that Joe Biden is going to have a fundamentally different policy on Julian Assange. He's a threat to US power. He's a threat to US empire, which is what US power effectively rests on. And I mean, what WikiLeaks really did at its most fundamental basis was it was a major transferal of power from the government to the citizenry to make their own minds up about what they perceive of their government doing in their own name. A second issue is that, I mean, a lot of the defence's point of that this is a political case was that it directly embarrassed the US government itself. So, I mean, this is not just about the war in Iraq. This is also about the administration that Biden was involved in, the Obama administration, such as the drone strikes on Pakistan, which were actually found to be illegal, and they stopped almost immediately after they were found to be illegal. So this is a political case that is not just directed against the Republicans, it's directed against the Democrats as well, and not just the Democrats, but Biden personally. But thirdly, there's a more kind of complex problem going on here, and that's the problem with Russiagate. So, I mean, the Democrats are still latching on to the coattails of Russiagate, and a major part of that was that Assange allegedly and almost certainly untruthfully colluded with the Russian security services to leak the DNC leaks in the run-up to the 2016 election that Donald Trump won. Now, this is part of the reason, in my opinion at least, why Donald Trump came down so hard on Julian Assange, because he tried to get Julian Assange to plead that it wasn't in fact the Russian government that supplied these documents, and Julian Assange refused. Because out of journalistic principle, he was able to say he was not a state actor, but he was not going to testify for his own pardon, for his own liberty. He wasn't going to testify on who gave him the leak. So we've got this really complex situation in which Biden and the Democrats are still trying to create this total conspiratorial narrative that the Russians are somehow responsible for their loss of the 2016 election, in cahoots with WikiLeaks, rather than the Democrats providing no real solution to the kind of structural economic issues in the US, which they once again are not. So I mean, so with regards to the US election, obviously it's complicated, but simply, I don't think Biden's going to have any fundamentally different policy on WikiLeaks and Assange.
Yeah, it's kind of like being stood in front of a tank, isn't it? And saying, well, if we paint the door red or if we paint the door blue, is it more or less likely to blow my head off? It's a tank, whatever the colour of the door. Thank you on that. I just want to check in case we... Yeah, could we touch on the role of The Guardian in all this? Because obviously, you know, many of our audience this evening may well have first come across Julian Assange and WikiLeaks through the stories that were promoted by The Guardian. The Guardian profited a lot reputationally from that relationship with Julian Assange, and it sort of felt like, you know, when the chickens came home to roost for that, they sort of threw him under the bus. Would that be, you know, am I being overly critical?
No, I think that's fair. I think that's fair comment. It's also true that The Guardian has now got an editorial line, which is to halt the extradition. So I would say that the course of this demonstrates that the problem of WikiLeaks necessarily, actually, and very effectively when the leaks were released, but conducting a kind of alliance with sections of the mainstream media. I mean, I guess the moral of this story would be, even when it's necessary to sup with the devil, use a very long spoon, because a significant part of the prosecution's case is now about whether or not WikiLeaks made unredacted releases which put in danger the lives of American operatives. Now, actually, they've had to admit in court that nobody's life was remotely threatened or indeed lost through these leaks, and that's part of the Americans' evidence. So we can take it, and they had to admit as much in the Chelsea Manning case as well. So that question is actually settled, but it isn't stopping the prosecution relying on the idea that WikiLeaks, you know, willfully and irresponsibly put this material out there. And the only really critical thing about the relationship with The Guardian is that actually it was a Guardian journalist, David Lee, in his book, who released the password that gave people access to the unredacted material. And even then, it was another site that put it out there on the internet long before WikiLeaks did. And I think that in the aftermath of that furore, the Guardian did do little or nothing, or worse, participated in stories which were damaging to Assange's case. Now, I think that's come to a halt now, but it did happen, and it did colour the public perception, and it did mean that it was something which certainly we as campaigners had to overcome, and are still having to overcome the effect of that. So no, that was I think a disreputable and dishonest period in the Guardian's attitude towards this, and I'm glad that it's come to an end. It's important that it has.
Thank you.
Can I just say, Kerry, in response to that, is that the Guardian's played a very shameful role in the persecution of Julian, just as it has done in the persecution of Jeremy. And Jonathan Cook, who's written about how the Guardian has persecuted Jeremy, has also written an excellent article about how the Guardian has been complicit, and so have Media Lens, and they've explained in great detail. So if there are people on this call watching who want to read more about it, I would direct you to Jonathan Cook's excellent article and Media Lens's article. That's all I wanted to add. I think, you know, much as one of the things with the so-called left is that they like to jump in and you know, give people a good kicking on issues they don't know very much about. And in this case with Julian, they've gone out of their way to talk about, you know, him smearing feces on the wall, you know, ill-treating his cat. They couldn't find anything better to say as journalists. They couldn't find anything better to say about the fact that tens of millions of pounds were being spent by the City of London on spying on supporters outside the embassy. They couldn't find anything to say about the way in which the British government is hiding what's really going on in the case. But they could find ways to make snarky remarks about somebody who is in huge amounts of pain and alone. And clearly, I mean, any human being would be in a great deal of trauma as a result of what Julian's been exposed to. So as far as I'm concerned, it's dump Guardian, because they have been absolutely horrendous in vilifying Jeremy and vilifying Julian.
Thank you, Deepa. And I would add as well, there's a fantastic article that Declassified put together, breaking down, it's kind of the anatomy of disaster with the Guardian, really, kind of how their sort of security experts, the decent journalists, were sort of jettisoned out and replaced with more compliant ones, who then built relationships with the very security services and intelligence agencies that they actually should be working, you know, against to some degree. And I think it is important for all of us actually to take the time to read those articles and educate ourselves, because when you have that information, you have that background, it's almost like kind of your sword and shield, really, that kind of prevents you also being, you know, battered about by these, you know, journalists who will come out with these glib assertions. It behooves all of us, I think, to really be down with the details so that we can confront that, you know, real time with these people when they try to do it. John, did you want to say anything more to that point?
Yeah, just very briefly, you spoke about that Declassified UK article about the Guardian's proximity to power and proximity to state power in the UK, and how that's becoming a bigger and bigger issue over recent years. I mean, with regards to Assange, you've got Luke Harding and John, you mentioned David Lee wrote a book in which they revealed the password, the encrypted password for the unredacted files. Now, the co-author of that book was Luke Harding, who is a national security reporter for The Guardian. And then Luke Harding is also responsible for publishing probably one of the biggest fake news articles of the past few years, in which he claimed that Paul Manafort, one of Trump's team, visited Julian Assange at the Ecuadorian embassy on 3 different occasions, for which no proof was provided whatsoever. They haven't been able to find any proof in the time since that occurred. I mean, the article even went into the details of what Paul Manafort was wearing on the days that he visited Assange. I mean, this was just brazen nonsense. However, the question has to be asked: from where is Luke Harding getting this information? And this is even more interesting if you look at the general editorial line of what Luke Harding writes about, and it's generally Russiagate, or the incoming Cold War with China, and various different things that rarely challenge or move away from the typical line pushed by the UK National Security Services. So yeah, on the subject of the Guardian's proximity to the British security services, it's certainly important to talk about Luke Harding's publications on Assange.
That's great, thank you guys. So I'm going to go over to questions and comments from our viewers now. First of all, I'm going to start with a comment and a question from Lisa Longstaff. Thank you for this, Lisa. So the comment first: great speech, Deepa driver. Glad you made it clear what Julian's up against. People in high places like us not to know their crimes, which WikiLeaks and others have consistently exposed. Hear, hear. And the question is, the way the Swedish investigation was dragged out was really perverse. Can you tell us anything about the progress of the legal case versus the Ecuadorian embassy security? Who would like to take that?
Shall I have a go, John, or do you want to go first?
No, you can go ahead.
Thanks. There's a really interesting case, for those of you who don't know, that's taking place in Spain at the moment. And the person who's defending Julian Assange, or rather having the case of Julian Assange there, is Baltasar Garzón, whom some of you might remember from the Pinochet cases. And what that case is about is there's a Spanish-based security firm called UC Global, which was providing embassy security at the Ecuadorian embassy. And this Spanish firm, in collusion with dark forces, was spying on Julian Assange within the sovereign Ecuadorian embassy, pretending to the Ecuadorian embassy that they were giving them some live feed information, but actually having a second layer which was being transmitted to the US. They were also colluding with the US to try, as John McEvoy said earlier, to potentially poison Julian or kidnap him and leave a door open around the side of the embassy. And the kinds of horrendous things they have done include, trying to steal Julian's child's diaper. And, Julian is a parent of young children, and I'm a parent of young children, and I feel really sad for Stella, Julian's partner. At a time, when we're all coming up to Christmas, we'd like to be with our families. And here is somebody who has not been able to even take her children when Julian was in the embassy to the embassy, because she was told they were planning on stealing the child's diaper in order to do a paternity test using the feces and the nappy. So Julian has been subjected to really horrendous treatment throughout and complete invasion of his privacy. He has had the basic thing in any criminal investigation, in any court case, is the concept of legal privilege, that you can have a conversation with your lawyer and the other side doesn't know. Here, his legal conversations were being taped. They were explicitly being told which people to spy on, what information to send back. And I cannot believe this case is even being heard in the British courts, the Assange case, when there is clear evidence of spying, clear evidence that it is a political crime, clear evidence of so much else. So this, the Ecuadorian case at the moment, I don't think, as far as I know, there is no judgment released, but I've put on the chat a video which NRD, which is the German state broadcaster, have done, which shows how some of the things about Julian have been a complete and utter stitch up, etc. So I'll put on some more information for those of you who are interested in the Spanish case. We don't have an outcome yet, but the information that's coming out is absolutely, jaw-dropping, the amount of horrendous things they've done.
Thank you, Deepa. I'm going to move on now because we've got quite a few questions to get through, so I don't want to risk missing questions out. So I'm going to go to a question from James Mealy. This came through Facebook, and James says, Starmer, I assume Keir Starmer, silent on this vital case. Does it reveal his attitude towards torture? not to mention the kind of relationship Labour will build with shady political figures in the US. John Rees, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I only wish he had been silent on the case, but he hasn't. In the leadership election, he made it very, very clear that he wasn't a supporter of Assange, that he thought that the extradition process was robust and it should all be left to the courts. I'd be staggered if somebody who was formerly the director of public prosecutions said anything different. And I think just generally on Starmer, it's remarkable how little comment there is about the fact that he has been a director of public prosecutions. He refers to himself, and his supporters refer to him, as a human rights lawyer. But I have never heard of any kind of left-winger or socialist lawyer who didn't do defense work, but actually ran the state's prosecution service. That is absolutely a unique position for anybody who regards themselves as on any wing of progressive politics to have done, let alone presided over the process by which the Swedish case was dragged out. As Lisa Longstaff quite rightly noted, it was under his watch that the CPS wrote to the Swedish authorities saying, don't get cold feet over this case. They were materially implicated in dragging that case out for as long as possible. So, I mean, it hardly needs saying in the current environment that Sir Keir Starmer is as establishment as it can possibly be. That's what a director of public prosecutions is. Do you think they hand this job to somebody who isn't 100% wedded to the establishment? No, of course they don't. Will he remotely or ever be a friend of the Assange campaign? No, he won't.
Can I just add to that? Sorry.
No, I was just going to say I'd love to sit here and offer a contrary opinion, but I really can't, to be honest. I mean, it's fairly straight up and down, that guy's position on this.
Can I just add that I think, as I'm chair of Camden Momentum, and our branch unfortunately falls within Keir Starmer's CLP, and we are horrified at the way in which Labour has abstained on the CHIS bill, and it goes to show yet again how weak Keir Starmer is on the protection of human rights, and particularly in relation to the Assange case. You have to recognise that the proceedings in Sweden never went past preliminary investigation stage, so no justice was ever likely to have been done either for victim or for person accused. And this is what Keir Starmer is about. He's a member of the Trilateral Commission. He is, he doesn't take a stand on the key issues. He lets other people do his dirty work for him, I would assume. And we are in a situation where it's pretty much the equivalent of the Trump-Biden, right? We have Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer, both equally bad. And to expect that, to see that the Labour movement is led by somebody like Starmer is an absolute and utter shame. And we need Jeremy back.
I'm going to go next to a question by Shona Davidson, because it sort of follows neatly on from there, because we were just talking about Sweden again. Was the UK-Swedish correspondence between governments provided to the UK court? Thanks for that question, Shona. Can anyone come back on that one?
I don't believe it has, because it's not germane to this case. Nothing about the Swedish process refers to the prosecution in the United States or their extradition hearing. So no, it won't have been. Okay,
great. Thank you for that. I've got two questions left. I'm gonna finish on a great question, which I think is the right place for us to go. But before we hit that question, we've got another question from James Mealy. James, you've been at it tonight. Thank you very much. James asks, what mechanism is applied to maintain such high levels of groupthink at The Guardian? Are individuals summoned into Viner's office and given a plain brown envelope outlining, outlining the do's and don'ts? I daren't respond to that myself. I will hand over to our illustrious speakers.
I suppose I'll take this one. Yeah, I suppose Chomsky describes this process best when he says, there's a slow filtration process that people internalize throughout all institutions, throughout life, throughout school, throughout secondary school, throughout universities, in their jobs. And you just slowly internalize what can and cannot be said within a certain institution, especially given its proximity to power, such as The Guardian. One way in which this manifests itself is if you look at the dearth of national security correspondence in The Guardian and the slow getting rid of them over the past decade or so. So the likes of Jonathan Cook, Seamus Milner went, Ian Cobain also went. As far as I'm aware, you would almost never find Mark Curtis at The Guardian. So national security correspondents start to get the kind of idea of what can and cannot be published based on what is and isn't and what they're getting rid of. Once again, Chomsky summed it up probably best in an interview on the BBC with Andrew Marr, in which Andrew Marr asked him, "What do you think I'm self-censoring? Do you think I'm actively trying not to say certain things?" And he says, "No, I don't think. I think you believe everything you're saying. What I'm saying is, if you didn't believe everything you're saying, you wouldn't be sat where you are as a prominent BBC journalist." So there's not an active process of Kath Viner slipping envelopes under the table. The envelopes are very much on the table, and everybody understands very well what their role in that institution is.
It's a great answer. Thank you, John. And yeah, I would advise anybody who hasn't seen that fantastic interview with Chomsky and Marr, get to YouTube and watch it, because it is absolutely fantastic. It's kind of like watching a grandparent sort of explain something in a withering way to a child. Okay, so last question, which I think is a great place for us to end the questions section of the evening, comes from YouTube and Maggie Harrison. Thank you, Maggie, for the question. Maggie asks, what can we do to help Julian? So what can viewers who are watching this, infuriated, wanting to do something to make a difference, how can they get involved in a material way?
Well, shall I say a bit about that first of all? I think the first thing is to understand where we are in this. So where we are in terms of the timescale, for instance, is very important, because for some reason that is beyond all rational understanding, in the British legal process, even a globally important civil liberties case like this first goes to a magistrate's court, i.e. to the court that you normally go to if you've got a motoring offence to deal with. And it's in front of an entirely junior magistrate who's used to dealing with those kind of offences and who is absolutely, clearly, completely out of her depth, not least because she's faced with two QCs, one for the defence and one for the prosecution, who knows so much more about the law than she does. So for all the absolutely true things that people have said about the derogation of justice in this case, there is a certain amount of it which is just incompetence and stupidity born of being in the wrong court. But it's going to end up in the right court. So when she gives her judgment on the 4th of January, which I think most sensible people expect will be in favour of extradition, it will get immediately appealed by the defence team and go to a higher court where there are people who know a bit about the law involved. Not necessarily any better, certainly not more sympathetic, but just know a bit more about their jobs. So that's going to happen. So the time, and this is important about the time scale for campaigning. The time scale for campaigning is going to reach into next year, at least, probably towards the back end of next year. And every time we go to court, it boosts this campaign because it gets it into the headlines, gets the things debated. There's more press coverage. People are engaged. So that's important for us. The second thing is, as I said, and Julian, when I visited him a number of times in Belmarsh before lockdown, is absolutely insistent about this. So just let me pass it on. He said, my supporters have got to stop talking as if we are a minority. We have got the whole of the Amnesty International NGO world is on his side. And that's true. We have got the majority of the mainstream press now, belatedly, but on our side. So don't talk as if we're stuck in a corner and being beaten the crap out of all the time. That's just not the case on this issue. And when we as a campaign ran a YouGov poll, there's more people. The first thing is there's more people who support Julian than don't. But the other thing about it is, and this is for a campaigner is the critical question, there's a huge number of don't knows in the middle. Now, don't know isn't hostility. Don't know is I'd like to hear more, is I can be won, is there's an argument to be had here. So the time scale is good, the direction of travel in the campaign is good, and what we really need is the Labour movement to step up to the plate. Because when, for instance, the ASLEF tube drivers union voted to support Julian Assange, that means you're getting into a network of people by a sympathetic route that you wouldn't be able to reach otherwise. When Len McCluskey tweeted on his official account for Unite that they were supporting Julian Assange, that's getting to people who really need to know about it. This is how we won on everything from the Anti-Nazi League to the Anti-Poll Tax campaign to Stop the War to the People's Assembly Against Austerity. Get into the roots of the movement and get that voice heard. So nothing's too small. If you can post on Facebook and Twitter and that's all you can do, that's great, do it. If you speak to your friends or your family or people in your church or your mosque, do it. If you can get a resolution passed in your trade union branch, like we did at ASLEF, like we're doing at Unite, like is coming up in the NEU, then do that. Because this is all about changing the mass of people's opinion, like we did over the war, like we did over austerity. When I went with John McDonnell to see Julian, man, that was a battle. That took us weeks to get an MP in to see somebody in a prison in this country. But when he came out, he got into trouble for saying this, but he said it's like the Dreyfus case. And he got into trouble because people said, oh, well, Dreyfus is a Jew, you can't make a parallel. But what he meant was this, and he was right to say this. We have got to make this a cause célèbre which echoes across the society as a simple injustice, as a simple matter of free speech and freedom of the press. And if we do that, then all those fissures and cracks that I talked about that are opening up in our opponents' ranks, they can be exploited and we can win. That's my view of how we should campaign over this issue.
Awesome. Thank you, John. Deepa, go for it.
I was going to say that for the people who are on the ground who don't know very much the case, there are a few key sources that are good places to find information about the Assange case where you won't get half-hearted smears. The first place is Craig Murray, the former ambassador to Uzbekistan, his blog. He's done some excellent court reporting. The other place to look for information is the Wise Up Action website of the Committee to Defend Julian Assange, which is the grassroots campaign organization. Of course, we have the main campaign, official campaign through the DEA, but the grassroots campaign has various protests and various people who understand what's going on. Jonathan Cook has written about it, as have people like Stefania Maurizi. It's very important to debunk the smears. So when somebody says, oh, the charges in Sweden, there were never any charges. Oh, what about X? You know the detail, and that's how you can change hearts and minds. I think it's also very important to get your CLPs and the Labour Party involved, your local momentum branch. Just make sure you pass a motion through that branch, because a lot of people on the left have been kept away from this because of the noise and the sound around it. And actually what we need to do is get to the heart of the case, understand what's going on, and recognize that this case is about us. And if you care about any other causes, if you care about the war, if you care about journalism, if you care about the environment, if you care about companies stealing from poor people, if you care about corruption in Africa, if you care about children going hungry, you need to care about WikiLeaks, and you need to care about Julian Assange, because without WikiLeaks, who exposed traffickers dumping off the Ivory Coast, without WikiLeaks, who exposed the war crimes, you wouldn't know, we wouldn't know what's really going on. And it's very important for us to stand with whistleblowers at a time when they are being really stamped on, and with true journalists when they're being stamped on. So please follow places like Declassified UK. The Canary's written there's some interesting articles. John McEvoy here has done a lovely little video summarizing what happened at the September trial. These are the kinds of people whom you should be, you can find useful information from. Mohamed El Mazi, for example, writes some great stuff. So thank you.
Okay, in which case we are now able to wrap up. I think what I'd like to do is give each of you a minute to just give us your final thoughts. What message would you like to leave our audience with tonight? I'm going to go, I think, left to right along my screen. So we will start with John McEvoy.
Yeah, I'd struggle to put it better than John and Deepa just then. But I mean, as I said at the start, if we say that this case is political, then we know it's not going to be decided exclusively in the courts. It's going to have to be decided somehow outside of the courts. So that means a maintained and a powerful public response to what's going on, and through all of the ways that John and Deepa just mentioned. Well, I think one thing that's probably going a bit ahead of myself for afterwards, but just to remember who was feeding us disinformation about this case over the past decade, and not to rely on them in the future for when we're sold lies about the next important event. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Okay, and John Rees.
Yeah, the simplest thing is, I think what Gareth Peirce is the driving force on the leader on Julian's legal team, and of course she has a terrific record of fighting, especially over the high-profile Irish cases, the Birmingham 6, the Guildford 4, and so on. So she knows what she's talking about in these matters, and she says, look, a case like this, a political case like this, it's never won just in the courtroom. It's won on the streets outside. And it's won because people campaign and refuse to accept what they're told by their governments and by the prosecution. And as long as you can be part of an alternative voice which tells the truth, which says, yes, I did want to hear the truth about Iraq and Afghanistan. This is the person that told it to me. They did a good thing, not a bad thing. They deserve to be free, not in jail. And it's as simple as that. So, you know, I think it was Einstein that said, you don't really understand something complex until you can explain it to somebody else simply. And the Assange campaign does look complex, and it has got a long, long tail and a long, long history behind it, and many, many different aspects which illuminate so many aspects of the way in which our society works. And we've explored many of them tonight. But when it comes down to it, it's real simple. He shouldn't be in jail and he shouldn't be extradited. And when you can make it work like that, I think those tons of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who haven't yet made up their mind will make up their mind, and will make up their mind in the right way.
Amazing. Thank you. And Deepa, do you want to bring us home?
Thanks, Kerry. I just want to remind people that you might think that your voice doesn't count, but it does, because it's ordinary people like you and me that make the difference. And it's ordinary people like you and me who will suffer if people like Julian Assange are extradited. And this is really important. This is an important case where what you and I do counts. And that's why I'm getting involved, and other ordinary people are joining through the Committee to Defend Julian Assange and through the DEA campaign. Please follow us on Twitter. Please share the information that the JADC puts out. Please follow the information that the Don't Extradite Assange campaign puts out. Join our vigils, join the grassroots. But also, if you're interested in the American elections and just starting to read about this case, you can read Max Blumenthal's excellent article that is just being shared via the YouTube channel. but also please just read more and think more about this case, and then you'll be able to tell other people what's really going on in the world. And it's really important that we all come together now. And thank you, Kerry, so much for having the Canary's first live event about Julian, because this is the most important press freedom case in the world, and Julian is the most important political prisoner in the world at the moment. Thank you.
That's great. Just thank you so much to all three of our speakers, John McEvoy, John Rees, Dr. Deepa Driver. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you tonight. Thank you for bringing your expertise. And over to you guys, our viewers as well. Some of you may have been following this case from the beginning. Some of you may have just joined this tonight because you wanted to know what was going on. You've heard some things about it. However long you've been a part of it, you're a part of it now. And we welcome you to be a part of this movement in the most important press freedom case in modern history. So thank you for taking time out of your evening to be with us. Before we go, I'd also like to acknowledge our technical team behind the scenes. We've got Nancy Mendoza, Andrew Butler and Pablo Navarrete, who have somehow managed to glue this all together and make it work for you this evening. So thank you to them as well. Thank you to everyone for watching, and thank you again to our excellent speakers. Until the next time, bye-bye.